Good morning. It's good to have everyone here. This fall, we started last week talking about worldviews, which are the assumptions and the perspectives that go together to make a way of looking at the world. And we started out with the Christian worldview. In the Christian worldview, we said the ultimate reality is God, and everything comes from God. And the core commitment of the Christian is to learn what God's will is and to do God's will. As we saw at the end of Ecclesiastes, when Solomon had been through all of the mysteries of suffering and why it is that sometimes the good suffer, something that we're starting to read about in our chronological reading plan through the Bible. We're starting on the book of Job today, and that's a big question in the book of Job. Do good people suffer or only bad people? Why would good people suffer? And so on. And at the end of many contemplations of that in Ecclesiastes, Solomon said, well, the whole task of man is to obey God. Do his commandments. Don't worry about all that other stuff. And that's the core commitment of the Christian, since we believe that everything comes from God and that we have a covenant relationship with God and God is involved in our lives. We have to respond to him in that covenant through obedience. But today, we will look at a different worldview that has some relevance to American history, and in particular, it has some relevance to something we're going to talk about next week, which is what kind of non-Christian ideas have seeped into our minds, and especially in the minds of youth today. That'll be an interesting discussion. With this worldview of deism that we'll look at today, what is its worldview? Well, deists believed in a creator who was infinite and powerful, but they didn't think he was involved in our lives. He was like someone who wound up a machine and got it going, the physical universe, and then stepped back and was detached from it. So some of the deists started out seeing God as a person with personal attributes like holiness and omnipotence and so on that we discussed as part of the Christian worldview. But over time, if they conceive of God as being not really personally involved in any relationship with human beings, then they start to see God as just kind of a force, not really a person. They don't believe that God is involved with us, which means they didn't believe that God gave us the Bible. They believed that was a human invention. They believed that God does not enter into covenants with us. He doesn't reveal himself to us through the written word, but only through nature. Now, they believed in sort of the same thing that Christians believe in terms of the universe. They believed that you could use the power of reason that God gave you to investigate the universe. But they believed the universe was what you would call a closed system. It obeys physical laws, but it's closed, meaning that there is no force, no activity coming into it from outside. Namely, they didn't believe that God intervened miraculously in this world. And this is one reason they didn't believe in the Bible. They don't believe any of the miracles. They believe God could intervene, but that he chooses not to intervene, that he has, for some reason, created everything and then stepped back from it. What did deists believe about human beings? Well, something very different, actually, from what Christians. They exalted reason. We're supposed to use our reason to figure out all of life, to figure out the external world. But human beings to the deist were not thought of as being created in the image of God. That's a biblical concept. And we discussed last week that it greatly affects how we treat other human beings if we believe that each person is created in the image of God. No matter what somebody might do to disappoint you or anger you, that's still another image bearer of God, and that constrains how you can treat that person. Deists, however, thought that you're only answerable to each other, to other human beings, for how you behave. You're not in a covenant relationship with God. You don't answer to God. So you only answer to whatever system of morality human reason can come up with. You answer to each other. They believed that you could learn through looking at nature. You could even learn something about the Creator by looking at nature. That's called general revelation in Christian theology. But they didn't believe in special revelation. They did not believe God revealed himself in the Bible. And all deists, there's some variety of belief. Just as some of them had a personal conception of God and some had a force or energy conception eventually, some of them believed in an afterlife. And therefore they even believed there was such a thing as salvation, but others did not believe in any afterlife. The Christian core commitment is learn God's will and do it, live by it. The deist core commitment is use the reasoning power God gave you as well as you can. How did deism come about? Christians always believed in the general revelation of the physical world that God created, the creation, and the special revelation of the Bible. But in the early 17th century, the original deists, who were mostly from England, taught that you could use your reason to guide your life, and that reason was even enough for salvation. By figuring out the right way to live using your reason, you could be saved by the Creator. So in other words, it was a good works-based salvation. Use your reason to figure out some system of morality and live by it and be saved by your good works. Save yourself was their conception. Now, one reason that this arose was that in Europe there were all these religious wars. If you study European history from the 1600s and 1700s, for example, you'll find Christians persecuting other Christians. If you were a Protestant in a Catholic country or a Catholic in a Protestant country, you might get executed. It was a very ugly scene in many, many ways. There were religious wars going on, and these influenced the deists to break away from all arguing about doctrine. Say, let's just live a moral life and do away with all organized religion, with the Bible, with doctrine. The motivation was to get away from these religious disputes. The Enlightenment was an era of philosophy that focused on human rights, the Universal Declaration of the Rights of Man, and the French Revolution, and so on. And part of the Enlightenment was this appeal to reason and this rejection of religion. Before the Enlightenment even started, the scientific revolution started, the use of inductive reasoning to investigate nature and so on. So that was another way in which reason was exalted. So the intersection of the Enlightenment and the scientific revolution helped lead people to prioritize reason over God's revelation in the Bible. And so deism fit its time. The time in which it originated had a certain way of thinking, and deism fit its time quite well. As I said, the earliest deists were English, but it spread to the European continent. And it was popular on the European continent among some intellectual leaders because of those religious wars. And for example, in France, Voltaire used the principles of deism to attack the Catholic Church. This is one of the things that happens when the church gets involved in politics. If the church gets intertwined with the government, and then people become disenchanted with the government, as they did leading up to the French Revolution, then they don't just attack the government, they attack the church. Because the church and the government are seen as being two peas in a pod. We see this if you study the Mexican Revolution. A lot of people think, oh, the Catholic Church is really strong in Mexico. During the Mexican Revolution, there were violent attacks upon priests and Catholic churches and so on by the Mexican revolutionists. Because, once again, the government and the church were in bed together. They were in league together. And so when a revolution starts against the government, if the church has become political, the church gets targeted too. And in fact, in terms of church attendance and so on, Mexico is quite weak on the Catholic faith. A lot of people don't realize. Now, only among some of these upper class intellectuals did deism spread to the American colonies by reading the writers of the English, and that includes some famous Americans, some of the founders of our country. For example, the 56 men who signed the Declaration of Independence, a lot of them didn't write about what their religious beliefs were, but 20 of them wrote extensively enough about their beliefs to where we can categorize their beliefs. Out of those 20, 11 of them were just Orthodox or conservative Christians. And so if you ever hear, well, most of the founders were deists or something, that's not true. 11 were pretty conservative Christians. 4 of them were liberal Christians. One important one was Benjamin Rush, who provided a little bit of Christian influence on his friend Thomas Jefferson. 2 could be classified as liberal Christians, but they were influenced by deism, including our second president, John Adams of Massachusetts, and the other being George Wythe of Virginia. I believe that Virginia has a Wytheville down south that was named after George Wythe. He was one of the Revolutionary era leaders. But the remaining 3 were deists. But you can see that there were a couple of famous ones out of those 3, Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson. And so how many, what proportion of our founders were deists tends to get exaggerated because there were several very prominent. And of course, we have founders in American history who were not signatories to the Declaration of Independence, including some very famous ones. George Washington, James Madison, and George Mason of Virginia would be in the category of liberal Christians. They didn't believe the Bible was free of error and so on, but they were Christians. But they were influenced by deism. Thomas Paine, who was a pamphlet writer of revolutionary books and pamphlets instigating the revolution, would be classified as a non-Christian, a very radical deist. On the other hand, there were Christians who did not sign the Declaration of Independence, who were very vocally opposed to deism, who were prominent leaders. Samuel Adams of Massachusetts and Patrick Henry of Virginia, Alexander Hamilton of musical fame. Then we have our local boy, Thomas Jefferson, or St. Thomas as he is known locally. He was a deist. He was not a Christian. The oldest college in America is William and Mary College over in Williamsburg, older than Harvard and Yale. And Thomas Jefferson founded the University of Virginia. That means he couldn't go there. It wasn't around when he was getting educated. He went to William and Mary, and he came under the influence of deistic professors at William and Mary and became a deist as a young man. Now, we know what his beliefs were because he wrote about religion a lot more than the other founders. Some of it was in private letters. His public writings, he wanted to be a little less controversial, so he tended to stick to the common denominator of Christianity and deism in his public writings. So in the Declaration of Independence, when it says, we believe that all humans are endowed with inalienable rights, rights that cannot be taken away from you, endowed by their Creator. Your rights are God-given rights. Well, that's actually part of the common denominator of deism and Christianity. Deists believe that. Deists believed in a Creator and that your rights came from Him. But that's where the common denominator tends to end. Thomas Jefferson believed that Christian morality was important for the health of the nation. So he believed in the moral aspects of Christianity, but he was not a Bible believer. In fact, he had a book called The Life and Morals of Jesus that was published after his death. And sometimes it's referred to as the Jefferson Bible. You might have heard it called that. What he did was he took a harmony of the four Gospels, and then he went through and got rid of all the miracles, all the prophecy, all the claims of Jesus to be divine. And what you're left with is Jesus as a good teacher, Jesus as a moral teacher. That's it. And so it's his own little editing of the gospel along the lines of deism. Take out all the supernatural, all the miraculous. Leave the morality, the common denominator. But that wasn't published till after he died. Now, you're not going to come across a lot of people in recent times who would describe themselves as a deist. Partly, I think you might say that deism was a halfway station on the way to atheism for a lot of people. Not very many people, when you get beyond the 1800s, were deists. In the 20th century, maybe you could describe Albert Einstein as a deist. But there's no doubt that deism greatly declined. And one reason is because the things that motivated it were the religious wars in Europe, and they declined. The lack of religious liberty came to an end because in the 19th century, all over North America and Europe, all of the different Christian denominations came to hold the point of view that you cannot force somebody at the point of a sword to be a Christian or to share your views. You don't accomplish anything if you're Catholic or Protestant by taking somebody from the other side and using government to attack them or punishment. That's not biblical. You can't force somebody to believe something. You can't force someone to be saved, and so on. That's not how Christianity works. And so religious freedom became advocated as essential to the gospel, not just a practical thing like, why don't we just stop fighting, that'd be better. But it's not Christian. And when you read about some of the religious wars and you read about Christians torturing other Christians to death because they were from the wrong Christian group in the 1600s and 1700s, then you realize that, yes, eventually there's going to be the realization this is not Christian. You know? And so we started to lose all of the motivation for deism. Benjamin Rush, who we identified as an a liberal Christian, was a friend of Thomas Jefferson, and he convinced Thomas Jefferson, we have all these new democratic republics that are taking over where there used to be kings, monarchies. You're putting power into the hands of the people. They all get to vote. If they aren't constrained by Christian morality, these democratic republics are not going to survive in the long term. And Benjamin Rush convinced Thomas Jefferson of that, and other deists of that, so that deists became convinced that they needed to at least advocate for Christian morality. But how long can you advocate for Christian morality when you've undermined the Bible, you've undermined the idea that you have a covenant relationship with God, that he's revealed his will, he's holding you accountable? When you've undermined all of that, how long will Christian morality survive? So deism is this halfway point between Christianity and atheism in some sense. And the deists had to either choose to go back to being Christians of some sort or atheists. It's not a stable situation. It's not a logically consistent point of view. And so it started to decline. The motivations declined, and the basic instability of trying to be in between Christianity and atheism destined it to fail. And so deism declined. But you might say the key idea of deism continues to influence even some Christians today. It's the danger of perceiving God as being remote, as being uninvolved with you, as being someone who created everything and got it rolling, but he's not really directly involved with each individual person. I mean, there's 7 billion people in the world. Can he really be involved with each one? Well, the Christian says yes. But we can be unwittingly influenced by this kind of attitude of, who am I? You know, who am I to God? And why would God care about me? And so on. And deism, as a bad influence, so to speak, is something we'll talk about very specifically next week. Next week is going to be a discussion class, because we're going to talk about several things that converge to have an influence, particularly on youth in America, based on actual studies. What do young people actually believe in America? And that is going to challenge us to think, what kind of influence are we on our children and grandchildren? And what are their influences from the outside culture? And there's a faint echo of deism, because as we will see, a lot of our youth today, when they're studied, when they're surveyed, picture God as not being all that involved in their lives, even when they say, yes, I'm a Christian. Jim. An agnostic says he's not sure if God exists or not. A deist says God definitely exists, he created everything. But that doesn't mean he's in a covenant relationship with you. Whereas the agnostic is one step from atheism, saying, I'm not sure God even exists. You know. So there's some common denominator as far as attitudes towards the Bible and so on. It's denying the special revelation of God in it. But
I don't believe that young people, even older people, are getting what they really need when they come to worship, because we're not really getting into God's Word.
well, last week we got into God's Word concerning what's a Christian worldview. When we look at a non-Christian worldview, I can't give you the Bible verses, for example, that support deism, because they aren't there.
You know, the church eventually will just
Yeah.
it disappears if we don't teach God's Word.
Right. I recall, well, I was raised in a different church, and I recall even at the age of 10 becoming disenchanted because we would go through a whole Sunday school class, and it was kind of be a good person exhortations without any biblical content of whatsoever.
The Bible is clear on how we should behave.
Yeah. Right.
Very clear.
Oh yeah. But they didn't teach it that way. You know. Yes.
So what is the actual definition of deism? What is the root of that word?
It means the belief in a God, but a God who is detached from human beings, detached from his creation. A creator God who is now uninvolved with his creation. There are other...
You believe in God, but not anything else about him. You believe he created the earth,
Right.
but then he's gone after the fact.
For some reason, he's just observing and remote. And you're not really accountable to him, therefore. Certainly these implications follow from that. Therefore, you're not really in a relationship with him. You're not really accountable to him. He hasn't revealed himself through the Bible to you because he's remote. He's uninvolved, you know. And then a lot of things follow from that. So.
So it's basically a matter of convenience rather than commitment.
Well, like I said, yeah.
Everyone has, it's an individual choice, right?
You decide what's morality and what, you know, and so on, and try to follow it.
So if it's convenient for you, then that works for you.
Yeah.
There's no commitment
Well,
involved.
like I said, the only commitment is use your reasoning powers.
Right.
So
Which we know are
I think that the deists came from an environment that was Christian. And so they took it for granted that if you use your reasoning powers, you're going to come up with something kind of like Christian morality. Well, we know now that's not true. If you turn people loose and say, you figure out what's right and wrong, take a look at the world around us. Does everybody agree what's right and wrong? Does everybody use their reasoning powers to converge on the same beliefs about right and wrong in today's world? Only if you start out with Christian assumptions that you don't realize that you are carrying along with you do you end up in the same place. Jay.
I was just going to say, you said this was the halfway point going for atheism on the other side, but now do you see it where you have atheists that are going back to try to hide that they're atheists by using deism specifically today in academia?
Well, it's almost that way because there are some prominent atheists who can't really come out and say that they believe in God, but there are actually prominent atheists in recent years around America and Europe who have said, you know what, this not having Christian morality isn't working out very well. And so they're kind of, you know, they've been called cultural Christians. You know, we need more cultural Christianity. We need to revive the influence that Christianity had because our cultures are going to pot. The question is, can you do that without actually believing in God? You know, can you do that just by recognizing that it would be good if we all had a moral consensus and shared it? That would be helpful to our society. Well, can you get there without belief? Can you get there just by wishing it so? You know, but that's, you know, even some of the most prominent atheists who used to debate Christians and so on are starting to say publicly, this isn't working out very well. Because they see society fragmenting and they see all kinds of craziness. But they're stuck in between. They recognize the need for the Christian morality, but they're not Christian. They don't really believe it, you know. So, anyway, so next week we'll look at something, we'll discuss something that's much more relevant to today's world, but this is background for it. Thank you.